Ma'am, first, good afternoon and welcome. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this podcast with us today. So, before we start, I'd like to briefly introduce Fiscus Lex to you. So, Fiscus Lex is a business and corporate law society at BITS Law School. So, Stuti and I founded this society in our first year. Now, essentially, Fiscus Lex was created to build a space where students interested in corporate, business, and financial law can learn, discuss, and sort of grow together. Now, what we essentially aim to do is bridge classroom learning with real world commercial insight through conversations like, through podcasts, research, events, and collaborations. And we're very happy to have you here today. And we're very, very excited for today's discussion. So, passing it on to Maitri.
All right, so good afternoon, everyone. Firstly, we are honored to host Ms. Priyadarshini Gunasekaran, a senior associate at Inventus Law Technology Partners, specializing in legal services for high growth technology startups. Ms. Priyadarshini specializes in general corporate law, private equity, venture capital, mergers and acquisitions, making her a key advisor for companies navigating capital raises and strategic deals. She is also a prolific scholar with publications on complex subjects like the role of consensus in GATT WTO decision making and the intersection of intellectual property and 3D printing. Her diverse expertise offers a uniquely holistic perspective on law. Ma'am, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Now passing it on to Soham.
To start off with the questions, so would you like to give us a brief idea on what the FEMA Overseas Investment Act of 1999 is and how it has altered India's overseas investment landscape? Adding on to that, do you think these changes positively influence the common man to invest overseas, keeping aside the institutional investment angle to this?
Yeah, thank you for the kind introduction. And yeah, Soham, to answer your question, just FEMA itself, it covers anything that is cross border, right? What that means is any transfer of money from India to outside India or any intake of money from outside India to India. So the idea is that the government is aware of whatever the outward and inward remittances that happen in India. Uh, and FEMA oversees investment rules and regulations that came into picture so that we can align on the entire process of getting money sending money from India to outside India. And earlier, before 2022, we had FEMA 120, which was essentially a patchwork of RBI circulars, notifications, and FAQs. And it wasn't very easy for anyone to follow because you had to check multiple documents to actually understand whether something was treated an direct investment or a portfolio investment, whether it's permitted or whether it's not permitted. It was a little bit more complicated before, right? And in August 2022, the FEMA overseas investment rules, regulations, and directions came out. uh, so the FEMA, just as an overall, the overseas investment rules. What is overseas investment? It means sending money from India to outside India. What is the process? What are the guidelines that you are supposed to follow? Under that, there are two types. One is overseas direct investment. The other one is overseas portfolio investment. All of these differences and how it works, everything is very clearly captured in your new rules that came in August 2022. Now, for a common man, or rather an individual investor, the rules work through something called a liberalized remittance scheme. That's called an LRS. So there is a limit on their investment that they can send from India to outside India, and it's around 250K. That's the limited amount that they can invest outside India per year. This changes every year, right? So every year it's always 250K that such investor has the right to invest outside. So the framework has definitely made it better. It has positively influenced a bunch of investments. But at the same time, the practical workings, how it would work is the banks who get involved, right? So when the banks get involved, they are essentially the gatekeepers who are the first line of person who gets into contact when this investment goes through. So they ask for a bunch of documents, they interpret the law very differently. Every bank has their own compliance team, everyone interprets it differently. So the law itself has definitely opened up opportunities for common man or individual investors to invest, but the practical implication or the implementation at the bank level needs to be a little bit more smoother or more consistent for any normal person to do that.
So, ma'am, as you mentioned about the 2022 rules that FEMA introduced, so I heard you mentioning that there is a cap for how much a person can invest every per year outside of the country. Is there any difference for the caps for a normal investor and, for example, an institutional investor or a company, or is it the same for everyone?
The cap is the same for everyone, but except there are a few distinctions and the way it works, right? So the cap itself is basically 10% or with control. So I think it'll be more better if I explain you what ODI and OPI is first, and then we can go into the caps. uh, ODI is overseas direct investment. What that means is, if a person, let's say me, I want to invest in the US. So if I want to invest, if I'm investing more than 10%, or if my investment is going to give me control in that specific entity, and let's say that entity is a listed entity, then it's an ODI. But in case of an unlisted entity, then any investment that me as an Indian resident making outside India will be an ODI. So anything that is not an ODI will be OPI. So that's the cap, right? Your cap is the 10%. But what is allowed and what's not allowed comes into picture when it's an individual and a institution, basically an entity investing. So I'll give you an example of the structure itself, right? So let's say I'm an Indian founder who is in India, and I want to create a US parent with an India subsidiary. Now, I'm in India. I'm going to be a director in the India company. And I am the founder, so I have to hold majority stock in my US company. But for me to hold majority stock, I can't as an individual, because I'm going to hold either more than 10, or it's going to be with control. So I definitely can't invest as an individual. So, but what the law allows is for me to create an entity. It can be an LLP, it can be a registered partnership, it can be a company, a private limited company. So in all of these three, I can create and I can put in money into those entities, and those entities can invest in the US company. It can be more than 10%, it can be 20%. There is no cap as such, but that's the difference, right? Whether you're a resident or a entity, and whether you have control, whether you don't have control, whether you have a subsidiary or whether you don't have a subsidiary, all of this matters when the cap comes into picture.
So,
Okay,
ma'am,
thank you.
as
Yes, so
yes,
continue.
so as you mentioned in your example that if an individual having or making a startup, they would prefer to make a parent company in the United States and then have an Indian subsidiary for the same. So this structure for the common man might seem a little complicated. Would you say that this is an area of investing that might deter Indian retail investors from investing overseas? And if yes, then what might be some other areas like this?
Uh, no, so they are quite unrelated, right? The structure itself was an example where that's a flip structure that you generally see or hear, where when your founders or the startups are looking for global structuring, where they're looking for global investors, then they would go with this structure, which is to have a US parent, Singapore parent, whatever, but their operations will be in India because their employees, customers, probably they are in India, right? So they set up this structure. But for retail investors to send money from India to outside India, it doesn't make any difference, right? It's a different structure here. And for just investment perspective, only your LRS comes into picture, whether you have already invested 250K or not from outside, from India to outside India. If you haven't, well and good, you can go ahead. But the only thing that comes into picture is all your compliance related matters. It will be the form FC that you will have to file, because any investment that you make from India to outside India, if it's more than 10% or less than 10%, it's still going to be ODI if it's in an unlisted entity. right? So any ODI compliance will have to be complied with. You will have to file Form FC, then you will have to file an annual performance report, and you will have to ensure you send your stock certificate, basically the representing that, hey, I have purchased this much stock in the company. I need to show proof to the AD banks about it. So there are a bunch of compliances that you will have to undertake if it is an ODI.
So, ma'am, your insight has provided a lot of clarity on ODI and how a retail investor would invest abroad. So, following this with the next question, so now with the globalization of Indian startups and the increased acquisitions abroad, do the current caps and control-based criteria for ODI, the more than 10% equity for a particular company, for example, adequately reflect modern business models such as cloud-based companies?
No. So that's the only issue, right? So the cap, the percentage that they have set, it makes sense from a legislation perspective where they want to set a cap of 10%, and more than that you can't. But practically, it makes it very difficult for any founders. It doesn't have to be cloud-based companies, right? It can be any fintech, it can be an AI-based company, or any software companies. And if they want to have a setup in the US and have a subsidiary in India, and they want to make any investments from India, if they want to get an India investor, then it's a very difficult process, right? Let's say you just have a normal foreign company without any India connections, and the founder is also in the US, and you have investors coming in from India. Then the foreign entity will have to be sure about all the compliances that have to be undertaken at India level. Because for you to do an ODI, you need valuation reports as per the AD banks. That's not what the law says, but they do want to know very sure that, okay, this is the valuation of the company, this is the price, this is the correct price at which the foreign entity is giving you as an Indian resident shares. All of this they want to be very clear about, so they ask for valuation reports. So it, whether it's 10% or more than 10%, then the foreign company which has no understanding of what the Indian law is has to think about all of these factors when they get the investors onboarded, right? So it's practically a little bit difficult, but from a legislation perspective, they do want to uh, control all the investment that goes from India to outside India. So it does make sense from their perspective, but from a practical founder standpoint, it's a bit more difficult.
So, ma'am, as you talked about the valuation reports which have to be provided by banks, so are financial institutions like banks and let's say SEBI and RBI, are they equipped to operate as effective gatekeepers for these ultra-specific niche rules, or does this create operational bottlenecks and interpretation uncertainty, as you talked about, with a foreign company having a hard time trying to understand India's laws?
Yeah, so it definitely does create bottlenecks, but let's just talk about banks who are meant to be the gatekeepers under the FEMA, right? So, like I said before, they are the first line of compliance. Every overseas investment, whether it's ODI or OPI, has to go through the authorized dealer bank. Well, that's what we call when it's an AD bank, right? It's not an authorized dealer bank. The idea is good, which is to prevent money laundering and to ensure that the funds are going out for legitimate purposes. But in reality, each bank interprets the law differently. Like I said, sometimes they ask for valuation certificates, even for very small share issuances. And others sometimes go into deeper, like, hey, I want a declaration from the foreign company. I want a declaration from the board of the foreign company. So the process itself is not uniform when you bring in the banks because they all interpret it differently. We don't have FAQs for the FEMA, which has come out yet. We are still waiting for the FAQs to give more clarification so that banks can uh, make the process uniform throughout each of this, right? Because the process definitely depends on which bank you approach, whether even which branch handles your case. Uh, so it is very difficult when you have to bring in banks in the entire process. Uh, but while the system itself is designed to ensure all the compliances, what is really needed is to just make it uniform, and the FAQs definitely from RBI on the FEMA itself.
So, ma'am, before proceeding to the next question, till RBI replies on the FEMA FAQs, for this interim period, do you think is there any current solution to this problem, or do we have to wait till there are more uniform rules?
No, see, there is no. Sorry, go ahead.
Nothing, ma'am. You go ahead. Yes.
No, so there is no solution as such, right? See, the fact is there is always going to be issue if it's someone who is involved. There is an intermediary involved because it's not a direct transfer, right? When you loop in someone like an AD bank, their only idea is okay whether RBI is going to be fine with it or not. And from this FEMA rules, the RBI has given them a lot of authority and power because so certain transactions have, there are two different transactions, one is permitted, the other one is approval method, right? So when there is approval method, that means you have to take the approval of RBI, and if you don't have to, then it's only have to be approved by your AD bank. So your AD bank having to approve certain matters, then you have to ensure they are satisfied with whatever documents they require. So the only way is for you to work close with the bank, and if you do want to do an ODI, then you first coordinate with the banks, let them know that, hey, listen, I'm going to do an ODI, and let me know whatever documentations you require. And nowadays, banks are also pretty helpful. If you do reach out to their your relationship manager, they help you out a little bit where they stay on call with you, because it's also important for them, right? Because they need marketing as well. So they ensure that, okay, I'll stay on call with you, we'll walk you through the process, and then the entire process takes a lot of time. So it starts with you opening a bank account for your company. Then it starts with you coordinating with the bank and saying that, hey, I'm going to do an ODI, what are the documents you require? Then they send you a list of documents. Then once you receive the documents, you definitely need a secretarial team's help, who can, basically a company secretary, right, who can fill in those documents for you and figure out, okay, this is the shareholding, this is how much you're going to hold before your investment, this is the cap table of the company, after your investment, this is the cap table of the company. Let the foreign company give a valuation report saying this is the price of the share that you're going to buy. Then let it say a declaration saying that this line of business is not anything related to any Pakistan or any territory related entities. So there are different kinds of aspects that your banks look into, and different banks look into different aspects. So a few of them look into whether it's a safe, whether it's a convertible note, whether it is what kind of share are you buying? Are you buying preferred stock? Are you buying CCPS? What is the difference? What is the conversion timeline? Is it 10 years? Is it, there is a mandatory timeline for the conversion of shares? There are different aspects that banks look into, and different banks look into different aspects. So they create little bit of operational hassle for the companies to go on with. So that's the reason why you have to work closely with them. That does help you sort things out a little bit.
Okay, ma'am. So that does bring a lot of clarity of the ground reality of how these regulations actually function in our country. So, in regards to that, how do you think India's overseas investment regulations compare with those of major outward investment jurisdictions such as the USA? So, is India progressing towards becoming a more competitive base for multinational expansion?
The difference is quite striking, actually, because in the United States there are almost no restrictions on how residents can invest abroad. The government doesn't need to approve it. It's probably some tax filing that they will have to do, some tax reporting that they will have to do. But other than that, there is no restriction, right? They can get investment happily, and they can invest outside India happily, from outside, but to India is going to be a little bit difficult. Again, your FDI framework comes into picture, and all the compliances to in India comes into picture, because now you need to have demat account, and you have to have a PAN. For a foreign investor who's a foreign resident, have to have a PAN. So there are multiple things that a foreign investor investing into India will have to think about. But just in the US itself, there is no restrictions for them to invest outside the US. But in India, by contrast, it's more of a controlled capital account, right? Because that means every cross border investment should always fit into the permitted category under the FEMA. You can't send money abroad for any reason that is not listed in the rules. But anyways, India is definitely moving in the right direction, because the 2022 rules has shifted the categories from approval route to automatic route. A lot of transactions have been shifted from approval route to automatic route, meaning you don't need RBI's permission anymore. You can just comply with whatever rules are provided. Whatever transaction is al- approved for you to already do is automatic for you to do, and then you can report it through your bank. So definitely, yes, India is gradually moving towards making a globally integrated investment hub, but it's not a free flow system like how the US or Singapore is yet.
So, ma'am, as you pointed out that there may be some occupational and operational bottlenecks in this, when disputes arise, what would your opinion be on the topic of dispute management in overseas ventures for many Indian companies? And what would be a legal point of view where you think India needs to integrate legal policy reforms to protect investors abroad without over-regulating cross-border corporate governance?
Yeah, on the dispute management side, just when thinking about it logically, right? When when there is a India company, let's say, and then it has invested abroad, let's say in Singapore, and there is a dispute. When there is a dispute, it generally goes for arbitration under the foreign law. If it's Singapore, it's generally SIAC arbitration that goes for. So now, if the India company does win the arbitration and it's going to bring back some money, when it is bringing back that settlement money, it faces FEMA again, where it has to transfer the money from FEMA to, that is from the Singapore company to India. So the bank will ask for certain documents to prove that the funds are actually legitimate and they are in compliance with the, when you did transfer the money to the US or Singapore, it was legitimate, and now when you're transferring it from the Singapore company to India, it's again legitimate. Sometimes even RBI might ask for some clarifications. So it's, overseas dispute management is just not about the legal proceedings, it's also about the enforcing perspective as well.
Okay, ma'am. So, since we've understood how, the current FEMA rules help one invest abroad and what happens once, a dispute arises, in regards to that, the 2022 rules that came in, I just wanted to ask that, is there any particular changes that that are made for foreign financial services or foreign entities that have no underlying businesses in India, but they seek to invest in the same?
Uh, you're talking about foreign financial entities making investment in India.
And specifically, foreign entities that provide financial services, if there is any relation to the same.
See, the FEMA overseas rules don't, the 2022 one, they don't actually deal with foreigners investing in India, right? Doesn't matter whether it's a fintech or whether it's a financial service company, it does, because it's actually the opposite. That's what the FEMA rules talk about, right? It's the Indians investing outside India. So technically, these rules don't change anything for foreign financial service companies or even overseas entities that want to put in money into India. That is captured by the FDI framework under the under the Indian regulations, uh, which is called the foreign direct investment. right? That's the difference. When it's overseas investment, it's India out, from India it goes outside India, but it's foreign direct investment. But from foreign it gets invested into India. But what the rules actually do change is the overall way India looks at cross-border investments, right? uh, the 2022 rules brought in much stronger emphasis on transparency, which is you have to be sure, okay, you have to list everything out to your AD bank saying, hey, these are all the things that I know about the US company that I'm investing in and all the investments that I'm going to make in, because I have to be very open about it to the banks. And I also have to give a clear classification. At least now I have a clear clarity on what a direct investment is and what a portfolio investment is.
So thank you, ma'am, for clarifying that. And lastly, I just wanted to ask, for someone like, for example, me, I'm just a second year student, and for someone like me to engage with a topic like FEMA, now for now, I've got a lot of clarity from you, but is there anything else that we should like know or something additional that we should keep in mind as someone who would be willing to invest abroad or someone who would want to work in this area as a legal expert?
Definitely right. So as an investor, it's a different way you look at, and as you move towards becoming a working professional, the way you look at is very different. So the first thing that you actually do is just read the law, read the act itself. So don't go through all the interpretations that's given under the articles or any other just legal blogs, right? The way you look at is actually look at the rules and regulations. You have to read the lines, what it says, how, whether the term is capitalized, if it's capitalized, whether it's defined, what is the exact definition. All of these things you will have to look into. And if it's difficult for you to get the interpretations, you can definitely go over all your blogs and research papers. But the first step you do is to look at the act or the rule or the regulations itself. So if you see the rules, the regulations, and the directions, they all say the same thing. Specifically, the directions and the rules and the directions and the regulations, it says the same thing. But it just gives you more clarity. And the more you read it, the more simpler it gets for you to understand the law itself. And also just don't memorize the law, because it's also try to think of how it practically works. I have seen, or even when I was in college, the way I have always looked at is, okay, I am going to just look into the blogs which has interpreted everything, and that's what it is about. I never think outside what it actually means, right? What the law actually means. So you have to look at the law and think about it in a simple way. If I was an investor, how would it work for me? What are the things that I have to comply with? So always take a scenario and then look into the law and see what it talks about. And if you are an actual investor who is intending to invest, please hire a lawyer. That's what lawyers are for. So probably lawyers will do the job for you.
Uh, Thank you, ma'am. I think that's all the questions we have for this segment. But thank you for taking the time out on a Saturday afternoon and providing valuable knowledge about FEMA and overseas investment as well. I think through this podcast, we've understood what the basics of overseas investment is, as well as the terminology affected by it, associated with it. Uh, I think I personally have also gotten a good insight on how laws within two countries can operate simultaneously. This can be a bridge between corporate governance for two countries, and I have gained some valuable knowledge on the same.
Uh, Ma'am, as Suvam has already put it across, but firstly, thank you so much for clarifying all the questions so wonderfully. And yes, thank you for taking the time out on a Saturday afternoon to be here with us. And I will pass it to Rihanna.
So, ma'am, I just wanted to, on behalf of Fiscus Lex and Bitslaw, I just wanted to extend our deepest thanks of gratitude to you for joining us today. Your expertise in corporate law and venture capital, particularly, has provided our listeners with invaluable practical insights on the FEMA Act. And thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with our audience and your time. It was a truly, truly enriching conversation, and I think all of us have benefited from it.
Definitely. Thank you so much for having me. It was very uh, I felt like I was back to college and then explaining things, I guess. But I'm very happy to be here. Please do reach out if you guys have any questions or just in general, hey, I want to understand this, right? I'm always available for you. Uh, then just thank you for having me. It was very sweet of you guys to give like such a kind introduction, and then there's no problem for me to take out a Saturday and talk to you guys. I guess it's very the more I explain, the more I learn as well, right? So that's what knowledge is. So thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.